In 1922, an expedition led by British archaeologist Herbert Weld Blundell was sifting through the dust of Larsa, an ancient city-state in southern Iraq. Beneath layers of sun-baked silt, they hit something solid, a four-sided prism of baked clay that, at first glance, looked like a modest office paperweight. It stood only 8 inches tall, yet every inch of its surface was covered in a dense, rhythmic pattern of cuneiform script. While its physical size was small, the timeline it carries was so expansive, it challenged our entire understanding of human history. This is the Weld-Blundell Prism, the most complete version of the Sumerian King List. It's essentially an official index of every city and every ruler that ever held power in Mesopotamia, but it doesn't read like a standard government record. It begins with a line that feels more like the start of a high fantasy novel than a dry historical document. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Now, mainstream archaeology tells us that Eridu was one of the world's first cities, established around 5,400 BC. But if we actually look at what the Sumerians wrote on this prism, the math simply doesn't add up. It does not make any sense whatsoever if you try to fit it into our modern timeline. The list claims the first king, Alulim, ruled for 28,800 years. His successor? Another 36,000 years. In just the first 5 cities mentioned, the list insists that 8 kings ruled for a combined total of 241,200 years. Think about that for a second. That is 250,000 years covered by just 8 guys. To put that in perspective, 240,000 years ago, modern humans were barely even a thing, according to the standard evolutionary model. We were supposed to be sharpening sticks in caves, not maintaining complex bureaucratic king lists in stone-walled cities. Usually, when academics see numbers like this, they roll their eyes and call it poetic exaggeration or mythological padding. And sure, I'm no Assyriologist, but if I tell you I caught a fish this big and then provide a detailed, verified GPS log of every fishing spot I visited for the rest of the week, would you assume I lied about the first part just because the fish sounded too large? Here's the problem. As the list moves forward, these astronomical lifespans start to drop. They go from 30,000 years to 1,200 years, then eventually to reigns of 30 or 40 years, lifespans we recognize today. The terrifying part is that the same document listing these impossible early kings eventually lists rulers we know for a fact were real. We found their palaces, their inscriptions, and their tombs. So, where exactly does the myth end and the history begin? Did the Sumerians just decide to start telling the truth halfway through the prism? Or are we missing something fundamental about the era they call the Antediluvian Age? And if these 8 kings weren't just legends, then who or what were they really? To understand why the Sumerians recorded such staggering numbers, we have to look at the 8 figures who defined the antediluvian or pre-flood era. These weren't just names on a page, they were the foundation of a civilization. The list begins in the city of Eridu with Alulim, who reigned for 28,800 years. He was followed by Alalngar, who sat on the throne for 36,000 years. When the kingship moved to the city of Bad Tibira, the reigns continued to defy modern biology. Enmen-Lu'ana ruled for 43,200 years, Enmen-Gal-Ana for 28,800, and the shepherd king Dumuzid for 36,000. These individuals, along with the final 3 kings in the cities of Larak, Sippar, and Shurupak, form a group that supposedly ruled for nearly 250,000 years. In our current understanding of history, 240,000 years covers almost the entire existence of our species. Yet, the Sumerian scribes recorded these numbers with the same matter-of-fact precision they used to track bushels of grain or movements of the planets. It suggests that, to them, there was a specific, disciplined logic behind the numbers. The key to this logic lies in the Sumerian sexagesimal mathematical system. While we use a base 10 system today, the Sumerians used base 60. It's the reason we still have 60 seconds in a minute and 360 degrees in a circle. In the King List, the massive rains are almost always multiples of 60. They use specific units called the Sar, which represented 3,600 years, and the Ner, which represented 600. Alulim's reign of 28,800 years, for instance, is exactly 8 Sars. Mainstream historians argue that these numbers are purely symbolic. They suggest that the scribes weren't recording literal years, but were using these large mathematical units to signal the greatness or divine nature of the ruler. It's like saying a king was larger than life by giving him a reign that was mathematically perfect. In this view, the years are a code for status, not a measure of time. If I tell you a historic figure was a giant among men, you don't go looking for an 11-foot-tall skeleton. You understand it as a metaphor for their influence. However, even if we accept the symbolic argument, the math remains remarkably complex. When you add up the reigns of these 8 kings, you get 241,200 years. Some researchers have pointed out that these numbers aren't just random multiples of 60, they appear to sync up with astronomical cycles, specifically the precession of the equinoxes. This is the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that takes about 25,920 years to complete one cycle. Why would a society, which mainstream history says was still developing the basics of urban life, be obsessed with 26,000-year astronomical cycles? It does not make any sense whatsoever if they were simply recording myths. To even notice these patterns, you need generations of stable, meticulous observation. This leads to a more professional but intriguing perspective. The King List might be a distorted memory of a genuine, high-functioning epoch that existed long before our standard records begin. Rather than literal immortality, some scholars suggest these reigns might actually represent entire dynasties or epochs of rule categorized under a single name. In the same way, we might refer to the Victorian era to cover many decades of complex change. The Sumerians might have condensed centuries into these mathematical blocks. It preserves the timeline while removing the need for a 30,000-year-old human. Yet, the Sumerians themselves didn't offer that disclaimer. They presented these figures as literal truth, right alongside the mundane details of canal building and tax collection. They believed their first kings were descended from heaven, a phrase that could imply a different origin, or perhaps just a level of authority that was considered beyond human. Whether you view them as legendary founding fathers or representatives of a lost, sophisticated era, the fact remains that their names were preserved with a reverence that borders on the obsessive. The transition at the end of this list is the most jarring part of the entire artifact. After the 8th king, the list doesn't just trail off into the next dynasty, it hits a wall. The record is interrupted by a catastrophic event that supposedly wiped the slate clean. A global flood that reset the Sumerian civilization in its entirety. If this were just a routine seasonal river flood, why would it mark the absolute end of an era defined by 28,000-year rains? Why did the supposed greatness of the kings vanish along with the cities they ruled? We have to wonder if the flood wasn't just a weather event, but a total systemic reset for the Mesopotamian world. And if that reset happened, what exactly was lost in the water that caused the lifespans of every king thereafter to begin a sudden dramatic collapse? The divide between the age of immortals and the world we recognize today is not described as a gradual change. In Sumerian records, it appears as a sudden break. On the Weld-Blundell prism, a long list of rulers, reigns, and dates continues in an orderly way until it stops abruptly. The next line is simple and direct: the flood swept over the land. This short phrase is a monumental divide, separating an era of legendary longevity from a new, more fragile reality. For decades, academia dismissed this flood as a purely theological device, something the Sumerians used to explain away the gap between their legends and their reality. But in 1929, Sir Leonard Woolley was excavating the royal cemetery at Ur when he decided to dig a little deeper. Beneath the earliest known human burials, he hit a clean, 8-foot-thick layer of water-laid silt. This wasn't just a patch of mud. It was a massive, pristine deposit of clay containing no artifacts, no bones, and no signs of life. Woolley realized that for a layer of silt that thick to form, the entire valley would have to have been submerged under an immense volume of standing water for a significant period. He noted that the civilization below the silt looked fundamentally different from the one that eventually rebuilt above it. Similar layers of sterile silt have since been identified at other key Sumerian sites like Shuruppak and Kish, often appearing directly above remains from the Jemdet Nasr period, around 2900 BC. It turns out the King List was recording a memory that was physically etched into the earth. By the standards of 2026, the scientific consensus suggests this wasn't necessarily a single global event, but a series of catastrophic regional floods. Mesopotamia was defined by the Tigris and Euphrates, rivers that were notoriously unpredictable. Geological surveys indicate that around 5,000 years ago, heavy glacial melt combined with extreme weather patterns likely caused these rivers to burst their banks on a scale that would have covered the horizon. To a civilization living in a flat river valley, a flood that covers everything you can see is, for all practical purposes, a global extinction event. This Mesopotamian account doesn't exist in a vacuum, which is perhaps the most intriguing part. It shares a striking DNA with the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Genesis flood narrative. In the Sumerian version, the hero is Ziusudra. In the later Babylonian version, he is Utnapishtim, and in the Hebrew tradition, he is Noah. While the names change, the mechanics of the story remain the same: a divine warning, a massive vessel, and the survival of a small group to restart humanity. The King List, however, treats this reset with a cold, administrative tone. It doesn't focus on the hero's journey. It focuses on the political fallout, explicitly stating that after the water receded, the kingship had to descend from heaven a second time. This is where the math starts to get truly uncomfortable for mainstream historians. Before the flood, the list claims kings ruled for an average of 30,000 years. Immediately after the flood, the numbers take a massive dive. The first post-flood king, Ngushur, is credited with 1,200 years. His successor ruled for 960. The math simply doesn't add up if we assume these were literal years as we define them today. If a regional flood happened in 2900 BC, and we have historically verified kings appearing just a few centuries later, these 1,000-year reigns would push the flood back into an era where the archaeology doesn't even support urban kingship. Which leaves us with the question, why would the Sumerians record a decline that so perfectly mimics a biological collapse? Could the flood represent more than just water? Some researchers wonder if it's a placeholder for a massive loss of technology or information. In this view, the long-lived kings represent a high-functioning epoch that was so superior that the later Sumerians could only describe it in units of sars and nairs. When that world was submerged, the survivors were left with the fragments of a civilization they could no longer fully maintain. They were effectively a species with amnesia, trying to rebuild a world that had literally been washed away. As the water receded and the new cities rose, the Sumerians struggled to regain that heavenly mandate. But as they did, something strange began to happen to the record. The names started to match up with the physical reality of the desert. If the flood marked the end of the immortals, what kind of people were stepping into the vacuum to take their place? To answer that question, we first have to look at how the Sumerians rebuilt their world. They didn't just wake up in a new era, they effectively restarted the clock in a city called Kish. According to the King List, this was the first place where the kingship landed after it descended from heaven for a second time. It is here that we see the first generation of post-flood rulers, and while they were still living for centuries, the scale of their power had clearly shifted. The first king of this new dynasty was Ngushur, who ruled for 1,200 years. He was followed by Kulasina Bel, who is credited with 960 years. While these numbers still sound like something out of a legend compared to the 30,000-year reigns of the previous era, it looks like a sudden, biological crash. This section of the list is a fascinating bridge because it shows the Sumerians trying to reconcile their massive legendary past with the shorter, more fragile reality of the present. This phenomenon is often called longevity decay. It is a pattern that appears almost identically in the biblical genealogies of Genesis. Before the flood, figures like Methuselah are said to have lived for nearly a millennium. Immediately after the event, the ages of the patriarchs begin a steep exponential decline until they reach the standard 70 or 80 years we expect today. In the King List, the Kish dynasty serves as the primary example of this transition. It's as if the divine quality of the kingship had been diluted by the disaster, leaving the survivors with a fading connection to their original source of power. One of the most intriguing figures from this period is a king named Etana. He is described in the list as the shepherd who ascended to heaven and consolidated all the foreign countries. Mainstream history generally views Etana as a mythical hero, but he is also mentioned in later historically verifiable documents as a great unifier. The Sumerians even had a dedicated epic about him that describes a desperate search for a plant of birth to secure an heir. In this story, Etana saves a wounded eagle, and in return, the eagle flies him up into the sky to find the plant in the heavens. When you read the descriptions in the myth of Etana, the details are surprisingly specific for a text written thousands of years before the invention of flight. The text describes the earth shrinking below as they fly higher, how the land looks like a small garden and the sea looks like a breadbasket. It is a very descriptive, visual account of altitude that seems out of place for a civilization that supposedly never left the ground. Whether you take the eagle literally or view it as a metaphor for an early, forgotten method of travel, the Sumerians were clearly trying to tell us that their early post-flood kings still possessed knowledge that was not common to the average person. However, even with these heroic feats, the lifespans kept dropping. By the time we reach the later kings of Kish, the reigns fall into the hundreds of years, then eventually the 80s and 90s. It is a steady return to the standard human timeline. This creates a friction between the King List and mainstream archaeology. If these kings were ruling for 900 years, they would have occupied a period of history that we already have a fairly clear archaeological record for, and we do not find evidence of individual humans living that long in the 3rd millennium BC. The math simply does not add up if we take it literally, but that does not mean the names are fake. If someone writes a biography and claims a person was a titan who moved mountains, we do not assume the person never existed, we assume the language is hyperbolic. But the Sumerians were incredibly disciplined with their records. If they said Etana ruled for 1,500 years, they might have been referring to his entire house or dynasty, using his name as a placeholder for a specific cultural epic that he founded. This leads to a realization that the King List isn't just a list of people. It is a map of how the Sumerians viewed the decay of their own civilization. They saw themselves as the descendants of giants, slowly shrinking down to fit a smaller, more restrictive world. But as we move further down the list, we hit a turning point that mainstream history can no longer ignore. We run into a king whose name is no longer just on a clay prism, but on physical, stone objects found in the dirt. This brings us to a figure whose name changes the nature of the mystery, a ruler named Enmebaragesi. He is the first king on the list whose existence has been proven by physical inscriptions. But here's the problem: the list says he ruled for 900 years. If the archaeology proves he was a real, physical person, how do we handle the fact that his impossible reign is recorded on the same document? To understand how the Sumerians viewed the transition from legend to reality, we have to look at a king named Enmebaragesi. For a long time, historians treated him as just another name on a list of mythical figures, no different from the rulers who allegedly lived for tens of thousands of years. However, archaeology eventually caught up with the text. In the early 20th century, researchers discovered multiple inscribed fragments of alabaster vases in the ruins of the Temple of Enlil at Nippur. These fragments bore a simple but profound inscription, Enmebaragesi, King of Kish. This find changed the nature of the mystery. Enmebaragesi, who ruled around 2700 BC, became the first person on the Sumerian King List whose existence is confirmed by a physical object from his own time. He isn't just a character in a story, he was a living man who commissioned temple offerings and led armies against the neighboring Elamites. But this discovery created a massive paradox for modern science. While the archaeology proves he was a real person, the King List insists that he ruled for exactly 900 years. The math simply does not add up. If we accept the vase as proof of his existence, how do we handle the astronomical lifespan recorded on the same document? It creates a friction that mainstream history has to navigate carefully. On one hand, you have a solid physical artifact found in the dirt. On the other, you have a record that claims this same man lived for nearly a millennium. It suggests that the Sumerians weren't just making up names, but they were applying a very different set of rules to how they measured time and power. The existence of this vase fragment places mainstream archaeology in a corner. If we accept the object as proof that Enmebaragesi was a real, physical person, we must confront the fact that his 900-year reign is recorded on the same artifact as his military victories. It suggests that the King List wasn't just a collection of myths, but a carefully curated timeline designed to graft the legitimacy of a lost, long-lived epoch onto the shorter reigns of the present. When you read the descriptions of this era, something that stands out is how the Sumerians used these names as anchors for their cultural identity. In their view, kingship wasn't just a job, it was a substance that descended and moved from one city to another. By giving Enmebaragesi a 900-year reign, the scribes might have been consolidating several generations of his family's rule into one recognizable name. It's a bit like how we might use the term the Tudors to describe a century of English history. But the Sumerians chose to personify that entire block of time through the founding father of the dynasty. This method of record-keeping allowed the Sumerians to bridge the gap between their heavenly origins and their lived reality. It kept the connection to the immortals alive, even as the actual reigns of the kings were shrinking closer to what we see today. But Enmebaragesi doesn't just appear in temple inscriptions and king lists. He is also a central figure in the epic traditions of Mesopotamia, often appearing as the primary antagonist to the most famous king of them all. Enmebaragesi is recorded as the father of Aga, who famously besieged the city of Uruk. This siege brought him into direct conflict with a ruler whose name has become synonymous with the search for immortality, Gilgamesh. For centuries, Gilgamesh was considered a purely legendary figure, but the fact that he is linked so closely to the historically verified Enmebaragesi raises a startling possibility. If the archaeology proves that the 900-year-old king of Kish was a real person, what does that mean for his contemporaries? We find ourselves at a crossroads where the names on the clay prism are becoming tangible. As we follow the list from Kish to the walls of Uruk, the line between myth and history becomes thinner than ever. If Enmebaragesi was real, then who else was hiding in plain sight within these ancient records? As the influence of Kish began to wane, the King List records a shift in the seat of power to the city of Uruk. This transition introduces a sequence of rulers that form the core of Mesopotamian heroic tradition, including figures like Enmerkar, Lugalbanda, and the most famous of them all, Gilgamesh. In the King List, Gilgamesh is recorded as the fifth king of Uruk, credited with a reign of 126 years. While this is a significant step down from the millennium-long reigns of the previous dynasty, it still places him in a category of longevity that challenges modern biological limits. What makes this section of the list particularly compelling is how it intersects with different types of ancient records. We have the King List itself, which provides a chronological framework. Then we have the literary tradition, specifically the Epic of Gilgamesh, which portrays him as a demigod searching for the secret to eternal life. Finally, we have the physical archaeology. At the site of Warka in modern Iraq, researchers have mapped the remains of Uruk's massive perimeter walls. These fortifications stretch for 6 miles and were once reinforced with nearly 900 defensive towers. The Sumerians themselves explicitly credited Gilgamesh with the construction of these walls, and the scale of the ruins suggests a level of engineering and labor organization that perfectly matches the King List's description of a dominant regional power. When you read the descriptions of Uruk from this era, something that stands out is the high degree of urban planning and social complexity. The city was divided into distinct districts for temples, residences, and gardens, supporting a population that may have reached 50,000 people at its peak. This was not a primitive settlement, it was a sprawling metropolis. The King List reflects this reality by detailing the first dynasty of Uruk as a period of intense expansion. Before Gilgamesh, the list mentions Enmerkar, who is said to have built the city of Uruk itself and supposedly engaged in a long-distance trade war with a distant wealthy land called Arada. The math of these reigns continues to be a point of debate. While Gilgamesh's 126 years are more grounded than the 28,000-year reigns of the pre-flood kings, they still occupy a space between reality and legend. Some historians suggest that these specific numbers might be related to the Sumerian system of tracking time through astronomical observation. They were meticulous about the movements of Venus and the moon, and it is possible that the lengths of these reigns were calculated to align with larger celestial cycles, effectively turning the King List into a cosmic calendar. The presence of Gilgamesh on the same physical artifact as historically verified figures like Enmebaragesi creates a strong case for his actual existence. In 2003, an archaeological team claimed to have found what could be the tomb of Gilgamesh beneath the former bed of the Euphrates River, using magnetic imaging to locate a large structure that matched ancient descriptions. While the site remains largely unexcavated due to regional instability, the discovery of such precise matches between the text and the ground suggests that the King List is more of a historical guide than we previously assumed. However, as the list moves past the heroic age of Uruk, a new pattern begins to emerge. The reigns of the kings continue to shorten, and the focus of the document shifts from grand, legendary feats to the practicalities of war and city-state rivalry. The kingship begins to move rapidly between cities like Ur, Adab, and Mari. This rapid movement suggests the King List was being used as a weapon of legitimacy. It reveals a curated narrative designed to favor specific cities while sentencing their rivals to historical oblivion. If the King List was accurate enough to lead us to the walls of Uruk and the vases of Kish, why does it completely ignore some of the most powerful and influential rulers of the era? There are kings who left behind massive monuments and detailed inscriptions of their own, yet their names are nowhere to be found on the Weld Blundell Prism. This raises the question of whether the list is a complete history, or if it was designed to hide the existence of anyone who didn't fit the official version of the timeline. While the King List provides a remarkably detailed framework of Mesopotamian history, its accuracy is often defined as much by what it leaves out as what it includes. As we move into the later dynasties, we begin to see a pattern of significant omissions that challenge the idea of the document as a neutral historical record. There are entire cities and dynasties that we know existed through archaeological evidence, yet they are completely absent from the Weld Blundell Prism. The most famous example is the city-state of Lagash. Archaeology has unearthed thousands of clay tablets, monumental buildings, and exquisite statues belonging to this city, particularly during the reign of King Gudea. He was one of the most prolific builders and influential rulers in all of Sumer, yet neither he nor any other king of Lagash is mentioned in the King List. This isn't a minor oversight, it is a deliberate exclusion of a regional superpower. If we only had the King List to go by, we would never even know that Lagash existed. This creates a serious conflict between the written word and the physical ground. The reason for these omissions lies in the specific political philosophy of the Sumerians. The King List was designed to support a very specific ideology, the belief that kingship was a singular, divine mandate that could only exist in one city at a time. The scribes who compiled the list were trying to create a narrative of a unified Sumerian nation, even though the reality on the ground was often a chaotic patchwork of rival city-states ruling simultaneously. By excluding Lagash, the authors were effectively erasing a political rival from the official timeline. If a city wasn't on the list, it didn't officially hold the divine kingship, making its rulers illegitimate in the eyes of history. This reveals a side of ancient record-keeping that is actually quite modern. The King List wasn't just a way to remember the past, it was a way to control it. It was a curated narrative designed to legitimize whoever held power at the time the list was being written, usually the kings of Isin or Larsa. This selective memory explains why the kingship seems to jump so rapidly from city to city. In reality, many of these dynasties were likely ruling at the same time in different parts of Mesopotamia. But the King List forced them into a single linear sequence to maintain the illusion of a continuous, solitary rule. When one city was conquered, the scribes simply recorded that the kingship moved to the victor, ignoring the fact that both cities might have been flourishing for centuries, side by side. It also changes how we have to look at those astronomical lifespans from the beginning of the list. If the Sumerian scribes were willing to erase entire centuries of history and powerful kings like Gudea to fit a political narrative, it suggests they were masters of information manipulation. The terrifying aspect of the King List is the realization that we are looking at a version of history that has been scrubbed and reorganized. It is a reminder that the people who write the records have the power to decide who is remembered and who is consigned to oblivion. This raises a question about the integrity of the entire document. If the later, historically verifiable sections are so heavily edited for political reasons, what does that mean for the early, legendary sections? Were the 28,000-year reigns a similar kind of manipulation, or were they based on an even deeper, more complex set of data that the scribes were trying to preserve within their curated timeline? To find that out, we have to look past the names and into the numbers themselves, where a hidden mathematical code seems to link the King List to the stars. To investigate why the Sumerians recorded such staggering lengths of time, we have to look past the names of the kings and focus on the specific numbers they chose. In many versions of the King List, the total duration of the pre-flood reigns adds up to exactly 432,000 years. This isn't just a large, round number, it is a mathematical constant that appears with startling frequency in ancient traditions across the globe, from the Norse Valhalla to the Vedic scriptures of India. In the field of archaeoastronomy, researchers have noted that 432,000 is a significant multiple of 72. This is the exact number of years it takes for the Earth's axial wobble, or the precession of the equinoxes, to shift the position of the stars by just 1 degree from our perspective. A full cycle of precession takes approximately 25,920 years. When you divide 432,000 by 60, the base of the Sumerian math system, you get 7,200. These ratios suggest that the Sumerians weren't just recording how long a king sat on a throne, but were embedding a sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics into their historical timeline. This creates a significant friction with the standard model of history. We are told the Sumerians were the first to develop basic urban administration around 3,500 BC. However, to recognize the precession of the equinoxes, you need centuries of precise astronomical data. You cannot track a 26,000-year cycle by looking at the sky for a single lifetime. It requires a stable, multi-generational effort of observation that predates the official beginning of Sumerian civilization. It does not make any sense whatsoever for a group of early farmers to possess this data unless they were inheriting it from an even older source. One perspective debated in 2026 is that the King List functions as an astronomical clock. By assigning these precessional numbers to their earliest rulers, the Sumerians may have been preserving a memory of a time when human history and the movements of the cosmos were perfectly synchronized, In this view, the 432,000 years represent an era of cosmic order that was physically shattered by the Great Flood, leading to the erratic and shorter reigns of the human dynasties that followed. When you look at the math, something that stands out is how the Sumerians used these units to categorize large blocks of time. They used the Sar for 3,600 years, the Ner for 600 years, and the Sos for 60 years to build their timeline. The total pre-flood era is often recorded as 120 Sars. These are clean, elegant numbers that suggest a level of mathematical discipline we usually associate with modern physics. It raises the question of whether the Sumerians were recording history as it happened, or if they were trying to reconstruct a lost past using the only constant they had left: the stars. Ultimately, we are left with three primary ways to interpret this document. The mainstream view is that the numbers are purely symbolic, a mathematical way of saying these kings were divine. The second theory suggests the reigns represent entire dynasties or epochs, condensed into a single name for political simplicity. The third, more provocative theory is that the list is a literal, albeit distorted, record of a high-functioning civilization that existed during the Ice Age, an era where humans tracked the heavens with a level of precision that we are only just now beginning to rediscover. What makes the Weld-Blundell prism so striking is the possibility that it preserves a record of events that later traditions struggled to explain or remember. Rather than describing civilization as a simple progression from primitive beginnings, the text hints at something different. It suggests that early societies may have seen themselves as inheriting the remains of an earlier world, one that had already achieved a high level of organization before it was disrupted. In that sense, the prism reads less like a myth of origins, and more like an attempt to preserve continuity after a collapse. It reflects a culture trying to reconnect with knowledge, authority, and order that it believed once existed but was no longer fully accessible. So what is your theory on these 28,000-year reigns? Are we looking at a sophisticated mathematical code or a genuine memory of a lost epoch of humanity? Let me know what you think this all means in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please subscribe for more explorations into the anomalies of our past. Thanks for watching, and as always, until next time, stay curious.